response, and it was really the, I don't know if I want to use the term instigator or the driving force, but he is key to making things happen both here at DU and across our community. So Dan, you'll be speaking, Marguerite McCormack, who is a therapist, and you know, these people will say more about themselves as they introduce themselves. But Marguerite is an expert in trauma, and she'll be doing a main presentation on some of these issues. Dan will talk mostly about the vet issues. And then Katie Bars from the Denver Vet Center will be speaking about some of the services they provide. So with that, Dan, Marguerite, you want to come on up?
I generally don't like pawing on my clothes in front of people before presentations. But,
Good morning. Like I said, my name is Dan Warwick. I'm a University College student on the BACP program. My mistake, after 16 years in the Army, I just went to work. I didn't bother finishing my degree. So after a couple of years, I decided it's time to do it. And the University of Denver was gracious and foresightful enough to, rather than quibble about my experience in college credits, simply said, you've done all these things in your life, we're going to start you as a junior, welcome to school. And that was the only school in the state that was willing to do that, so I really have to compliment them on doing that. And after a couple months, I realized that there's a lot of veterans on campus. Right now, there's 253 using VA benefits. George Cassidy, who's the City and County Denver Veteran Service Officer, estimates there's another 200, like me, who are going to school who are veterans that aren't taking veteran benefits for the VA. So there's a lot of us on campus, and the school is aggressively recruiting veterans on campus. So I expect that number to double next year. So this is an issue I'm really passionate about, and I'm glad that you all managed to find some time to come. Thank you very much. So with that, I'm going to start this and talk about some veterans issues. One of the things you'll discover when you first start talking to a vet when they've first gotten out, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, they've served in the Philippines, Horn of Africa, Eastern Europe, you'll ask them, well, who are you? What do you do? And they'll say, I was 101st Airborne, I was 82nd Airborne, I was Ranger, I was a Marine. Their identity is very closely tied to their military service. So when I was doing this, I kind of just ignored my past and started going straight into the discussion. And so I want to remind myself, the people here today, where I came from. So a little photo montage of my life in the military. For everybody that was here in the Army, that was my proud awarding of the Sham Shield when I made Specialist, which in the Army means you have all the authority and none of the responsibility. It was a great time. The center picture is when I made Sergeant. My friends in my unit had planned for a week all the crap they dumped on me, to include some stuff that was sitting in the motor pool for a week that looked like something for a sci-fi movie. The first sergeant was nice enough to turn the fire hose on us and clean us off. Top upper picture, I changed from infantry to broadcasting. I was the art director for Armed Forces Radio and TV service. That's the largest non-commercial network in the world. We broadcast to 129 countries. When I left Germany, in the bottom left, I received the Meritorious Service Medal. That was an era when we were supporting peacekeeping operations in Bosnia, Croatia, Somalia, Rwanda. Did a lot of stuff for that. And then lastly, the picture that kind of leads me off, that was taken at Grafton Air Training Area right before the wall came down, when everybody in Europe was on war alert. We thought it was going to be a war. About 2 weeks after that picture was taken, a 50 cal machine gun, which is a machine gun that's 117 pounds, rolled off the vehicle and crushed my feet, which is why I'm a disabled vet. But don't worry, the machine gun was fine, totally undamaged. The Army was happy. So yeah, I'm a disabled vet. It doesn't show. But I have enough metal in my feet to set off airport metal detectors. So one of the things I... So, with that, let me tell you about my guy Nick. Nick is one of the 5 veterans I mentor. Nick was the guy I didn't worry about. Nick was one tour Iraq veteran. He had a plan. He was enrolled in school. He wanted to be a helicopter pilot. He had some struggles with the VA getting him to pay for that, because initially the GI Bill didn't specifically say you could be a rotary wing pilot. They said fixed wing, so there were some struggles with that. He had saved almost all of his money in the year he was deployed. He had a girlfriend. He had a good support system. He was focused. He knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to be graduated in 2 years and out getting a job. Last year I was working for the U.S. courts in their public affairs office, and 11 o'clock at night Nick calls me. I didn't recognize him at first. He was a sobbing, shattered wreck of a human being. He would alternate between gasping, crying, just bursting out with emotion, and then drifting off, you know, empty, vacant. I didn't even know I was talking to somebody. Finally get out of him that he's in the parking lot of his ex-girlfriend's apartment complex. He says, I don't know how I got here, I don't know what I'm going to do next. At that moment, I heard him chamber around the 9mm gun I knew he owned. I was in DC, he was in Denver, there's nothing I could have done. But we talked, he kept talking, he kept talking. He laid out stuff for me that in the year I'd known him, he'd never shared with me any other time. Right? And eventually, I got him to realize that he had a problem, he needed to get help, and I sent him, he went to the vet center the very next day. So Katie, I want to thank you guys again for having a really, really great place for vets to go to. So, at the end of it, he asked me, he said, Dan, what happened? Why does this happen to me? What's going on? I said, I knew, but I couldn't say, because I'm not a clinician, but Nick had PTSD, and it had taken about a year for him to come to grips with it. So, my statement about this is this. You can be prepared, you can have a plan, you can have a support system, and you still might need help. So do it. If you're a veteran and you think you need help, don't wait. There's plenty of help for you, we're more than willing to do it. So, I want to talk about some of the systemic issues that are associated with veterans. When you first get out, when you're sitting there in the classroom, you're just like, I want to go home. I want to go get drunk with my friends, I want to go party, I want to go hang out at the mall, I want to do whatever. You're not focused on your immediate future. And they're putting out this information, you need to access the system for help, and it's just, because again, you're looking at the fence, you're thinking, I'm out in 2 days, 14 hours, 3 days, 7 seconds. You're not focused on you. So, the reason you need that information is the system is incredibly difficult to access, right? If you're an Iraq and Afghanistan veteran, the Department of Veterans Affairs has a specialty clinic set up just for you, once a week at every nearby VA facility. Most people don't know where it is, don't know what time it is, or how to access it. The VA is getting better about that, but it's still difficult just to find. You are eligible for care as a veteran, but you're not automatically enrolled for care. That's an important distinction, unfortunately. What you need to do when you first get out of the military is enroll for VA care. That form is called the 1010EZ. It is anything but. It is 7 pages long, 2 pages of which are instructions. And up until last year, it said on the form, if you need help, contact a veteran service officer. The VA wouldn't even help you fill the thing in. Now, in the last year, they have changed that to not only have a hotline for help, you can actually fill it in online and submit it automatically, which is a great help. But again, I guarantee you, if I ask a vet that's gotten out in the last 3 months if he knows where to find that, they can't. The problem is once you submit your claim, whether it's for health care or disability, right now we're facing a 1 million claim backlog. I think this number has actually shrunk a little bit. I think we're below 180 days to process an initial claim. But say you make a mistake, say there's something wrong, and you try and do it yourself, appeals can take 2 to 3 years. Right? The form themselves, I don't even bring them anymore because they weigh 20 pounds. The 1010EZ is 7 pages long. I already forget the number 21. Disability claim is 46. I can't remember. The claim for disability is 17 pages long with 5 pages of instructions. So they're complex, they're hard. There is veteran service officers like the VFW, the DAV, the American Legion. Every county in Colorado has a veteran service officer to help you fill it out. The state will help you fill it out. I advise you to do it if you need to do it because it's very complex. All right? The capacity is overloaded. Here's an interesting statistic that's horrible. More than 2 million people have served in the global wars on terror since 9/11. Right? Slightly more than 200,000 of them have gotten out and are starting to use VA facilities. That 10% is currently overworking the system. The average appointment time at the Denver VA hospital between the time you make it and the time you get it is about 3 months. All right? And then even though the VA is going through a big hiring, well, they kind of alternate between a hiring freeze and a hiring bust and a hiring freeze and a hiring, they're still really short on capacity. They're working on it. I give them credit. They're trying as hard as they can, but they're still incredibly short on it. Colorado is worse for benefits. Matter of fact, we're 49th out of 50 in the United States for veteran benefits. Right now, as a veteran, you can get a fishing license and 300 days of sunshine. Those are your veteran benefits from the state. The only good thing is North Carolina's worse than us. So we're not at the bottom. Okay. Vets are now ending up, because we don't have care, we don't have systems in place, we don't have community support in place, they're ending up in other systems. Why? They've got PTSD, they've got traumatic brain injuries. They have major chronic depression. They're not getting treatment. More than 50%, I actually think that number is low. Statistically, 50% of vets do not seek care. That's part of the society we're in. Right? And even then, those that do seek care, because of the overloaded system, they get minimally effective treatment. The systems themselves are still grasping, learning with the unique issues of Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom veterans. It's not a fault of the system, it's just that much radically different. The care in the VA system, what I've kind of discovered is still based on the Vietnam era of care. We're still basing all of our lessons learned on that. Not that that's a bad thing, there's a lot of great things we learned from that. But Bill Conroy, who's the director of Colorado Military and Veteran Affairs, made an excellent point. He said his generation in Vietnam, when they lost a limb, they wanted a leg that looked natural, when they could put a shoe on, when they could put a pants leg over to look normal. Iraq and Afghanistan vets, they lost a limb, they want a sea leg. They want a titanium leg that they can go rock climbing, bike riding, and stay active. So there's two different sets of care that we're looking at. And I think one of the unrecognized things is vets are a hidden population. One of the things I hear in the Veteran Court Initiative is, there's no vets in Denver, why are we doing this? Well, like I said, there's 1,500 vets on the American campus. There's about 500 here. CSU told us they have 750 at their campus. Interesting statistic, if you count the city of Aurora, which has about 160,000 vets, and the city of Denver with 45,000 vets, we have more vets in the metro area than Colorado Springs does. Now, there were these two places called Lowry and Fitzsimmons. I don't know if I'm old school here, but a lot of people got out and retired. Go figure, they came to Colorado, thought it was pretty nice, so they stayed here. So we have a lot of vets in the communities. All right, here's what's happening now, and Marguerite, I really want you to take credit for giving it out at some point, for the work you do. Vets will be seen by other systems other than the VA, somewhere between 55 and 60%. You go to those civilian providers, those community-based providers, they don't ask the right questions. Again, not because of their incompetence, it's just their level of training. Military-related PTSD and TBI is radically different than the civilian. It needs specifically trained people to handle it. So, with that, that's kind of the basic things that every vet is facing. I'd like to turn over to Marguerite, and she can talk about the facty stuff, the scientific stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dan is sort of a one-person agency in himself, so amazing. My name is Marguerite McCormack. I've been specializing in treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder for the last 15 years. I used to be the coordinator of the student council from the University of Colorado, Denver. Then I ran their response to the shootings at Columbine High School for 3.5 years. And then I was the director of trauma services at Jefferson Center for Mental Health. Since then, I've done a lot of training and consulting on disaster mental health, trauma, and vicarious trauma. I'm in private practice about half time. And I actually teach here as an adjunct in the Graduate School of Professional Psychology in their International Disaster Psychology program. So even given that I teach here, I almost got lost getting into this building. I'm talking of PTSD and TBI. I am not a neurologist or a neuropsychologist. It's because I have TBI. I have had 2 serious traumatic brain injuries in the course of my life. And of necessity, I've had to become much more familiar with the downstream impacts of that. Even given my experiences, I didn't routinely start asking clients in my private practice until about a year ago if they had ever sustained a head injury. Right? And as soon as I started asking the question, what I found is that a significant proportion of them had sustained brain injuries. We're just beginning, we're at the tip of the iceberg on treating traumatic brain injury. I don't know if you remember the story of Kelly McGregor, who was the CEO of the Rockies. He had been a quarterback in college and then had been on the Broncos for a couple of years. And he died at 48 of viral cardiomyopathy, which is just a freak of fate. You get some sort of a cold with a virus and it goes to your heart. When the year before he died, he and his wife went down to the Broadmoor for a nice weekend, and when they got to the room, he flipped on the TV, and there was a documentary on chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, which is what happens to your brain when you sustain repeated traumatic brain injuries. And what they found is that it leads to very early dementia. The average, by the way, the average age at death of a professional football player is 56. And a lot of them are presenting with dementia in their 40s. They just had the first case of someone who had only had college football experience who died of CTE at 42. He killed himself. But what led to that was suicidal ideation and downstream psychological sequelae that did that. So it's and just to really put the icing on the cake for this, if you are playing football in high school and you have full contact practice, you can have as many as 700 subconcussional impacts a week. So this is obviously something we need to know. Now, when he died, they did an autopsy on Kelvin McGregor, and what they found is that indeed he did have chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So his wife said that actually it was a God thing. She was grateful that he had passed when he did, because he would not have been able to bear losing his faculties. So that'll just give you an idea of its presence in the culture. So when you're dealing with vets, you're dealing with geological layers, and actually there are more than this. There's post-traumatic stress disorder, which affects, depending on which statistics you read, in these two conflicts, between 12 and 18% of returning veterans. Frankly, I think it's higher. Traumatic brain injury, the estimate is about 30% of returning OEF vets will have a possible traumatic brain injury. 30%, that's huge. Major depression, statistically speaking, almost as many vets will present with major depression as will present with PTSD. They're both post-traumatic, but it can go either way. Actually, they overlap about 95% of the time with their symptoms. So even if you're treating depression, you have to treat it in a trauma-informed way. There's transition issues, which Darren will speak about, and systemic issues as well. So I'm just going to let you read this. And talk a little bit about the categories of PTSD from OEF. The first is trauma related to combat or witnessing overwhelming events. And it's important to know that you do not actually have to have been in combat to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. That is a common misconception. In the military, and I'm just beginning to discover the depth of this, you bond with your battle buddies to a tremendous degree, and it's not just if something happens to you. If something happens to one of your battle buddies, it can impact you tremendously. And we'll look at some of the statistics on that in a moment. Military sexual trauma, which is much more prevalent than people think. If you are a woman in the military, this is an appalling statistic, you are much more likely to be raped and shot. And a fairly recent Air Force study indicated that 50% of men in combat theater may have suffered sexual assault. So there is, they just started a brand new center. Is it, Katie, is it in Florida for men with?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And Katie will speak a little bit about this as well, specifically for men who suffer sexual assault in the military. And last but not least, vehicular trauma. When service members go out from bases, they travel in vehicles that they travel as fast as they can. They also travel in vehicles that have doors that weigh 300 pounds. So if they are blown up, or if they get into a vehicular accident, the chances that they're going to be fairly grievously wounded are huge. So criterion A for post-traumatic stress disorder, and we're all sort of, or at least I'm waiting with bated breath to see what the DSM-5 is going to come up with for their new definitions for PTSD, is that you had to have experienced, witnessed, or have a loved one experience or witness an overwhelming event. Right? And the second criteria is it had to have caused fear, helplessness, or horror simultaneously. And one experience of sufficient severity can change the way your body and brain works over the course of a lifetime. To give you an example, there's something called the Average Childhood Experiences Study, which was a joint effort of the Centers for Disease Control, Emory University, Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, California. They sent a questionnaire to 26,000 of their consumers, and 17,000 were in the completed study. And Kaiser's really smart about this because they like to see who utilizes their services the most and plan. And there were 8 adverse childhood experiences: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, death of a parent, substance abuse by a parent, did I say mental illness of a parent? Oh good, thank goodness. Witnessing, battering, what's the one I'm forgetting? In any event, incarceration of a parent. Those were the 8 categories of adverse childhood experiences. And they discovered some things that are nothing short of astonishing. You can go to the CDC website and look up this study. If you just go to cdc.gov and type in ACES in caps in the search engine, it will bring you into a study. Bottom line, if 48% of the people who answered the survey had no early childhood adverse experiences. Give you an idea of the demographics. All of them had health insurance, which made them unusual these days in our culture. 75% of them were Caucasian. Most of them had some college. Of the 52% that reported adverse childhood experiences, those who had 2 or more had higher and more serious rates of cardiovascular diseases like heart attacks and strokes with earlier ages of onset, autoimmune disorders like chronic fatigue, Epstein-Barr, lupus, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, which usually is downstream from smoking, but not necessarily, substance abuse of all kinds, trauma and substance abuse related twins, car accidents, teen pregnancy, risk-taking behaviors, fetal death in teen pregnancy, when all other variables were accounted for, and more than 50 sexual partners, in addition to psychiatric diagnoses and suicidal ideation. So, as a result of this, they founded the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, because what they have now discovered is that early childhood trauma is a public health risk on the order of smoking. So they founded the National Child Traumatic Stress Network to address this specifically. So that's just to give you an idea about how trauma, how prevalent it is and how it changes the way your body and your brain work. So the symptoms fall into 3 clusters. Again, we're waiting to see what it's going to look like in the DSM-5. The first is re-experiencing, which is a phenomenon of traumatic memory. Most of us, at least who are over 40, know about memories, that it tends to degrade with time. And what we know from Eric Kandel's research, among others, is that memory changes every time you access it and bring it out. Isn't that interesting? So query. I'm not even going down that road, but anyway. So traumatic memory is stored differently. It is stored on the right side of the brain. It does not degrade with time, which means it is experienced at the same level of intensity that it was originally stored, right? And it gets experienced overwhelmingly physiologically in sights and sounds and flashes and smells, and the internal sense of being out of control. So re-experiencing are intrusive memories that show up not when you want to recall a memory, but when they want to show up, usually in response to a trigger. There's going to be a sight, a sound, or a smell. Avoidance is perhaps the most troublesome symptom cluster. It's when people avoid people, places, and things that remind them of the event. I can always recognize, well, not always, but I've got a pretty good suspicion I have an event in one of my classes or in one of my talks when they're sitting in the back of the room against the wall directly where they can see the door, right? Over time, what can happen with PTSD is you can avoid, you live in one little room and you really don't want to go out and see people. And this is possibly the most troublesome symptom cluster. And the third is hyperarousal, which just means you're jumpy, you're irritable, you have difficulty concentrating. Hypervigilance means you're always scanning the environment for danger, which is a good thing if you're a law enforcement officer or a correctional officer or a military service member, but it's a bad thing, for just running around, because over time what it does is it wears out your adrenals. And when you need energy for orienting your concentration, just the business of everyday living, it's just not available to you. So, we've talked a little bit about this before, 12 to 18% of returning vets meet criteria for PTSD, and another 30% have subclinical presentations, which means that they don't meet full criteria. Now, what's important to contextualize this is PTSD is actually a pretty difficult diagnosis to get. It has to have been as a result of a single incident, all of the symptoms, right? And it's what they call a fastidious diagnosis. And that was because PTSD only came into being as a diagnosis in 1980 because some brilliant people recognized that battered women's movement was on the rise in our country, and returning Vietnam vets had the same symptoms. And so it was designed specifically to be fairly difficult to get that diagnosis. It's also what they call a sticky diagnosis, which means if you have PTSD, you are much more likely to have other psychological disorders on axis 1, other mood disorders, and sometimes diagnoses on axis 2. Extremely frequently, you have substance abuse as an attempt to self-medicate, and physical problems. PTSD shows up in the body more than any other diagnosis in the diagnostic and statistical menu, right? So when you're dealing with PTSD in an OIF, OEF vet, you are almost always dealing with substance abuse and chronic pain of some form or another. Excuse me. So what are the numbers so far? We have in this conflict the highest injured to kill ratio in any conflict in the history of the United States. There are, if you are injured, they have mobile medical units that follow troops, and they can get you stabilized, right, and to a treatment facility extraordinarily rapidly. And so people are surviving injuries that they would never have survived, perhaps even 2 years ago. If, for example, if you have a traumatic brain injury and you wind up, you get airlifted to Bala Air Force Base Military Hospital, they can get you scanned, get your blood work done, and get you into the operating room in 18 minutes. If you have a traumatic brain injury, you have a 98% chance of surviving it if you go to Bala. If you're here in the United States and you go to an emergency room with a moderate to severe traumatic brain injury, your chances of surviving it are about 71%. So, a lot of vets who are diagnosed with physical injuries are also diagnosed with PTSD. Also, there's rapid redeployment, and Charles Ho, who's probably the best-known researcher with regard to OIF, OEF vets, says that there's really no time to mentally reset between deployments. They're back here for 3 months, they're working, they have to be on base, they have to do what they're going to do. So they don't really have time to sort of ratchet down. They feel they can't because they know that they're going back. Now, to give this a little bit of perspective, in the Vietnam War, 17% of those who were eligible to serve served. In this conflict, 1%. 1%, which means that same 1% is going back over and over and over and over again. And so what you see is people who have multiple deployments. And after the second deployment, you see the level of symptomatology rise, and it levels off around 5, which is appalling in and of itself. 5 deployments seem like an awful lot to me. And there's a huge number of traumatic exposures. So I'm just going to let you read this too. What can you say? The median number of traumatic exposures is 17. Now there's something called an exposure scale which measures severity of exposure. And this is McFarlane and Wise's research. And what they came up with is a scale. And 100 on the scale is witnessing someone's grotesque and unusual death, right? Watching someone being grievously injured. Watching civilians, particularly children, be killed. And handling remains that are dismembered, particularly good indicators of downstream PTSD. If there's an algorithm of PTSD, it is severity of exposure, what's called the dose-response relationship. The more severe the exposure, the more exposures you have, the more likely you are to develop some downstream mental health sequelae. So the PDHRA is taken by every service member when they return. And no blame attached to this whatsoever. I would do exactly the same thing. When they first get back and they're asked about their symptoms, they lie. Because if you accurately describe what's going on with you, if you happen to be impacted, what they'll do is immediately separate you from your unit and send you to a treatment facility. Social workers will chase you to the bathroom. And it is understood for a month, which is, you didn't laugh. Is this because it's the School of Social Work that you didn't laugh? But they don't want to be separated from their families for a month, which is completely understandable. So what you see is that every subsequent testing, the level of symptoms rise. So how does PTSD work? There is a parallel fear processing system in the brain that is subcortical, which means that it's 95% of the time it's below the level of consciousness, below the level of thinking, judging, and planning. And it is most frequently seen in acting out behavior. Trauma, people reenact trauma. Traumatic reenactment is the heart of PTSD. So what happens is that when you're having a traumatic revisitation, right, is that it shuts down the higher areas of your brain in sequence. And it starts with the frontal lobe, which is thinking, judging, and planning. And you think to yourself, why would the brain do this? Why would it shut down the frontal lobe? And it's because, you know, if, like one of the romantic poets, you sink to the bottom of the river Liffey and you say to yourself, do I really deserve to live, right? When you're in some sort of danger, if you're in a burning building, if you're in a car accident, right? You're not going to get up and run. Right? So what it does is it shuts down some of the more reflective parts of the brain. Then it shuts down the temporal lobe, which is responsible in part for emotional, not emotional, it is certainly responsible for emotions, but also for language production and understanding. Until finally, the only parts of the brain that are really functioning adequately are the amygdala, we'll talk about that in a second, particularly the right amygdala, and some stuff going on back in the frontal lobe. So if you look at this, this is a side view of the brain. And what happens is information comes into your body through one, actually Antonio Damasio, who holds an endowed chair, is a neuropsychologist at USC, says that we have 19 senses, not just 5. You have a GPS system, for example, in your body that tells you that you're in this room, on this campus, in this city, in this state, right? You have pain receptors that actually anticipate pain. They've done studies where people are looking at images, one after another, and they've got heart monitors and galvanic skin response monitors on them, and they can actually anticipate if the next slide is going to be disturbing. There is some mechanism, they don't know how this works. Isn't that interesting? In any event, so information comes into your brain from one of your 19 senses and gets routed to the thalamus, which is kind of like a train switching station in your brain. And the thalamus then routes the impulse to whatever part of the brain is supposed to process it. If it has to do, for example, like today, you're thinking, you know, you're trying to remember, probably the frontal lobe is involved. If it had to do, you're looking at me, so there's something lighting up, or you're looking at the screen in the back, the occipital part of your brain. 75 to 80% of the information that comes into your brain, by the way, is visual. Right? But if that impulse, that information, answers one of 2 questions, which is, and this is Joseph Ledoux's research, can this hurt me, or am I in danger? Right? And the brain does not distinguish between psychological and physical. What happens is that the brain routes that impulse down a single neuronal pathway, very fast and dirty system, to the amygdala, which then alerts the hypothalamus, which is sort of the master gland of the endocrine system, sends out a flood of stress chemicals like epinephrine and cortisol, and shuts down the frontal lobe of your brain. So just to give you a picture of what this looks like, this is a woman, a mud fud. Professor Lanius was originally at Penn State, and now she's at the University of Ottawa, and she has done, this is a PET scan, positron emission tomography, which measures blood flow in the brain. And because glucose is the fuel of the brain and cannot be stored, it gets transported by blood, and it is assumed that the areas of highest blood flow are the areas that are working the hardest. Black is the area of heaviest blood flow, red is next, yellow is next. So this woman had been in a car accident in which she had been severely injured and had developed PTSD. The top series, that's the side view, the back view, the top view, are when she was presented with a neutral stimulus, which was in this case what she had for breakfast. And nice warm brain, lots of balance, lots of stuff going on there. The second series of exposures was when she was asked to recall her car accident. So this is what you are dealing with when you are dealing with PTSD. PTSD is overwhelmingly a non-verbal experience. So, and it does manifest, as we found out in the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, it does manifest in the body. And it manifests a great deal with chronic pain. So when you're dealing with an OIF, you're dealing with a lot. You're most frequently dealing with PTSD, about 30% of the time. You're also dealing with TBI. You're dealing with chronic pain, right? You are probably dealing with substance abuse and probably another diagnosis on axis, major depression or anxiety. So it is a complex treatment picture. Yes?
Just an aside, mental health, behavioral health treatment, and law are very verbally based professions. And we tend to be very verbal ourselves, and we want clients that are very verbal. So if we go back to the previous slide, how verbal are you when you're triggered? Not very much. So just to kind of factor that in. Some of the judicial system that we've been working with is starting to kind of go, oh, okay. I'm asking them a lot of questions. They're not coming back with much. I just thought it was because they were a jerk. They don't have a very warm brain or a very verbal brain. How do we help them calm down so they can be more?
So could everybody hear what we're saying? Okay.
Thank you, Laura. So, military sexual trauma. And women represent 15% of the active duty force. And one of the things to remember is there is no such thing as a meaningful front line in this conflict. You know, when we think of war, I just saw Legends of the Fall over the weekend, and it was World War I, and you would have people in trenches, and then they would get out of their trenches and they would advance toward each other. That's not how war is now. War is overwhelmingly a guerrilla kind of phenomenon. And so women are pilots, women are medics, women are drivers, and they have to fight just the same as men. So in combat theater, they are disproportionately represented in the bagging and tagging detail, which is difficult. Interestingly enough, women in the bagging and tagging detail here in the United States suffer much lower rates of PTSD, and they're trying to figure out why that is. Has anyone here ever seen that movie, Taking a Chance, that was on HBO? Wasn't that extraordinary? It was about taking a military escort of someone who had been killed in Iraq back to his home, and it was done with such extraordinary respect and care. Right? And I think it's because perhaps here in the United States it's so ritualized and contained, and it is considered an honor, right? As opposed to in combat theater doing it very quickly and having no ritualized way of processing grief. So what is vicarious trauma? It's what happens with helpers or family members, people who surround the person who is traumatized. And frequently the manifestations can parallel PTSD. And it can lead to active PTSD itself or to burnout, which is a different phenomenon, slightly different. And we can talk about that later. So let's talk about some possible academic issues with PTSD, since we are here in an institution of higher learning. Impaired memory, concentration, and attention. And this is because frequently, if you are triggered in class, for example, what will happen when the frontal lobe goes down is you lose the ability to concentrate, to pay attention. You need your frontal lobe for that. You have to attend for something to engrave in episodic memory. Right? By the way, trauma, you don't have to be attending, you don't have to pay attention for it to engrave. It's a different kind of process. Difficulty switching between intellectual tasks. You'll remember, I don't know if you've ever had the experience where maybe you're cooking and you need to go get an ingredient and it's maybe down in the basement, and you get down to the basement and you forget what you went down there for, right? And then you go back up to the kitchen and you remember. It's because it is, that memory is state dependent, right? It's in this case, location dependent. Traumatic memory is state dependent memory. So you could have learning, in one subject, but not be able to transfer it to another. Difficulty with subjects involving new learning, again, because memory, it is difficult to consolidate. Now, also, one of the signal symptoms of PTSD is insomnia. And what we know with reasonable certainty now is that memory consolidates when you're asleep, right? So if you're not sleeping, you're not consolidating, you're not remembering. So new learning is difficult, and particularly subjects that build on each other every day, like chemistry and math. Difficulty with large amounts of information, like literature and history, perhaps. And these symptoms do improve greatly with successful treatment of PTSD. So what is a traumatic brain injury? It's a bolt or jolt to the brain, and there's 3 classifications: mild, moderate, and severe. There is a movement among those who have so-called mild traumatic brain injury. It is considered mild only because the loss of consciousness is brief. It is not mild in its effects. It is important to distinguish this as a descriptor. The medium to severe traumatic brain injury usually picked up in polytrauma centers, which means that you have a traumatic brain injury and another major injury, either to an organ system or some sort of amputation or limb. There's 6 polytrauma centers in the United States, and other Veterans Administration facilities are trying to upgrade their services so that they can be broader to these vets who have multiple injuries. And 420,000 vets, and I think that number's higher now, may have experienced TBI. Now, our systems are in no way capable at this point of dealing with this. Most clinicians are not trained to recognize TBI because we're just beginning to get our arms around it, right? And most primary care physicians do not even answer the question, do not even ask the questions. There is on the DBVIC website, and that's in, we have the resources guide here.
Normally we would, but I have every issue, and so we don't. But it's a good opportunity to say there's a sign-in sheet on that back wall, and if y'all sign in and put your emails down, we'll get that out to you.
No, that's great, and a read-only copy of the presentation as well. So the DBVIC website has a 4-question screening. It's not diagnostic, it's just for screening for TBI. And that would be a very helpful thing to have if you're a primary care physician, a chaplain, a mental health worker of any kind, a physical health worker of any kind, because at least you know the questions to ask. So I went to a conference recently that was actually here on the DU campus. It was organized by Kim Gorgans, who's over at the School of Professional Psychology. And it was amazing. It was the TBI rock stars. It was the best conference I've been to in years. But one of the researchers said this, and it really impressed me, that traumatic brain injury is the most complex disease known to man and the most complex of organs. Right? So what are the predictors of a good outcome? First is the age of the patient. The younger you are, the more likely you are to recover well. The Glasgow Coma Scale rating, in general, the higher it is, the better off you are. Loss of consciousness, the longer you are unconscious, and these are not absolute correlations, they're just the predictors we've identified so far. The longer you are unconscious, the more the prognosis degrades. How long you were amnestic post-event, and also if you are an alcoholic, it predicts a poor outcome. One of the things I ask people to do, for example, if I have a client who sustains, I have a client who was hit over the head by a bottle and sustained a traumatic brain injury, and one of the things I asked him to do, which by the way his emergency room physician did not ask him to do, was not to drink alcohol for a month and to rest. There's actually here in Colorado a program for school children called the Brain Stars program that has a complete protocol for how to deal with brain injury in young people in schools. So what are the symptoms of TBI? The signal symptoms, the ones that you see the most frequently, are headache and sleep disturbances. 68% of people with mild TBI will have significant sleep disturbances. Dizziness is common. Sensitivity to light and sound, photosensitivity and photosensitivity. When I have TBI survivors who are in my office, frequently I have to close the blinds because they blink all the time because they're photosensitive. Anxiety, depression, irritability. Fatigue is extremely common, and part of the reason is that if you think of brain circuits, for example, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, much like how I just whipped that right out, is one of the circuits that's most concerned with concentration, memory, motivation, and emotion. Right? And it's a circuit that has a very distinct tract through your brain. And if you think of a tract, right, and you think of every year when you put up Christmas tree lights, you lay them out on the floor, you straighten them, if one of the bulbs is out and the whole string goes out, that's kind of like what happens in your brain when you have interrupted one of those pathways. The reason you get fatigue is that your brain constantly has to do workarounds. It would usually use that tract, but now it can't. So there are different types of injury. Diffuse axonal injury is when there is what's called a translational injury. At the time of the injury, the body torques, right? So what happens is that the brain, there's a shearing action in the brain. And some of the things that happen are the myelin sheath can pop off. And what people didn't know until recently, physicians didn't know until recently, is that traumatic brain injury continues to happen for several months after the original injury. Because what happens is there is a storm of excitatory neurotransmitters, right, that goes down the axon, that long, skinny thing that comes out of the cell body, and it roughs up the inside of the axon. So it disturbs neuronal transmission, and it continues for months. So a lot of the interventions that they're trying to come up with now are how do you arrest traumatic brain injury right at the beginning. And one of the newer treatments that's really exciting is actually doing intravenous progesterone drip, 100 milligrams right at the time that they first find out about injury. Because one of the things that traumatic brain injury does is it squeezes, the anterior pituitary. And what the progesterone does is limit the amount of injury. They're also thinking of things like mild hypothermia, putting people in chilling them down, right, so that there isn't as much swelling. But we're still in our infancy. We don't really know. So diffuse axonal injury is hard to image on most of our current imaging techniques that we have. Has the longest recovery curve. There are a couple of imaging techniques. One is called diffusion tensor imaging, that actually you can see the migration of water molecules across nerve cells. It's really cool. But there's only 5 of them in the United States. And MEG scans measure electrical activity in the brain. And in order to have a MEG scan, you have to have a room that's underground with lead balls that are 4 feet thick. So understandably, there aren't that many of them hanging around either. So you can also have what are called focal lesions, which are injuries to specific parts of the brain. Like let's say I were to slam I'm trying really hard not to do this, slam my head on this podium. What would happen is called a coup contra coup injury, which means my frontal lobe would bang against the inside of my skull, and then it would rebound off the back, right? So front and back. And what a lot of people don't realize with coup contra coup injuries is that it does affect both parts of the brain. What you get is something that looks like a bruise, a hematoma. And what happens is if you have blood in that bruise, that tissue around that lesion will die. Right? So you have to have other neurons take on that particular function. Temporal, here, language and emotional regulation. Parietal is a felt body sense, but it also has a coordinating function of the brain that we're just beginning to understand. So injuries, my traumatic brain injuries have both been to the occipital temporal area of the brain. The result is I have no sense of direction, and I have no depth perception, which makes driving with me really exciting. And I about 3 times a year, I will, you know those doors that open like in hospitals, and so I will slam right into it. Yeah. So the problem is that with each traumatic brain injury that you get, right, the effect is multiplicative. It's like brain injury times brain injury, not brain injury plus brain injury, okay? And it gets easier and easier to get a traumatic brain injury to the point where people who've had many, I have had, miraculously, one client who we all thought had the worst case of ADHD we'd ever seen in our lives. And it turned out he had 14 concussions, including 3 in a row, meaning one day after another. There's something called second impact syndrome, where if you get a concussion, the next day after you get the first concussion, within actually 48 hours, and that can actually cause death. So concussion is not the mild thing we've all been led to believe it is. And occipital is visual. So other sources of injury, small blood vessels can rupture. Now, an interesting thing, for example, is that in car accidents, where you have people with traumatic brain injuries, you can have them focal lesions, but in women, in mothers, what they see is they get more translational injuries, because what happens is when an impact, they turn to see how their children are in the back seat. And so what happens is the brain literally twists like this. You're just really happy you came to this presentation, aren't you? This is so cheery. And I'm not going to discuss all this, but mitochondrial damage. The mitochondria are the engines of the cell. And what they found is after traumatic brain injury, you have far fewer mitochondria than you had before. The average number is 17. After traumatic brain injury, the average number is 2 per cell. And lack of oxygen. And by the way, the inside of your brain is not smooth, right? It's bumpy, and it's got things sticking out in the middle, particularly here around your nose and the sphenoid process. So there's a lot of tearing that can happen in there. The good news is that most people who have a mild traumatic brain injury return to baseline functioning within 3 months. And those who don't look like this. All the things we've talked about, and you can read. But probably the most frustrating one is that your processing speed slows. It's like having a computer that runs very slowly, and this is frequently the source of the most frustration for vets in academic settings. Previously, they were able to study, read much more quickly, and now they can't. They have limited insight into the impact of their actions on others, which really increases caregiver burden for people around them. And they frequently have very poor judgment. When the frontal lobe is offline, frequently your judgment is impacted. Behavioral issues, these are the most common ones. Substance abuse, impulsivity, right? No filter, again. One of the functions of the frontal lobe is to inhibit impulses. Like if you have an impulse to say something really nasty to one of your teachers, right? Which is stupid because they give you grades, right? But what happens is your frontal lobe says, that's probably not a good idea. If you have a traumatic brain injury, you may not have that filter in place. Rage, and it's a different kind of rage. It's not like PTSD rage, which is usually in response to a trigger. It seems to come out of nowhere. It is overwhelming, and after it's over, you ask the person with TBI why they were angry, and they don't know, and they're immensely remorseful. Right? So. And anxiety, mood disorders. So downstream, what you're looking at with TBI is all of these things. Mostly reduced quality of life. And what I'd like to call your attention to is the bottom line, which is increased rates of suicide. Traumatic brain injury plus substance abuse equals 21 times baseline rate of suicide. And Katie is going to talk more about this when we get to her talk. So we've talked a lot about this, and I understand there are people here from your disabled student services. But all these things that we've talked about before, fatigue, distractibility, and it can manifest in any one of a number of areas, and it is difficult to predict which area it's going to show up in. It can be verbal or nonverbal, processing, memory, visuospatial, like it is with me, right? And sensory issues. I also, after traumatic brain injury, I developed, what do you call it? I was doing a double backflip on a trampoline when I was 17 very badly, and I smashed my head in, had a compressed skull fracture with a subdural hematoma. Recovered okay from that. That was when I first lost my depth perception. And then about 10 years ago, I had a 200-pound door fall on my head when I was working at Combine Connections. And it's since then that I've had a migraine every day for 10 years. Migraine is extremely common on TBI sufferers. And I actually had surgery in December to remove 4 of the peripheral nerves in my head to limit pain. So migraine is very common downstream, and it's also something that is poorly understood even by neurologists. Less than 5% of the curriculum for neurologists is around the subject of headache. Right? So you have to go to somebody who really knows what they're doing, and there's only one person in the tri-state area who really knows what she's doing. For those of you who may be veterans with TBI, her name is Judy Lane. So, enough said. And poor sleep. So this is really interesting. I want you to take a look at this if you would. You put PTSD and mild TBI next to each other, and they really look almost exactly the same, right? Until you get down to, on the PTSD side, to numbing. And the differential for mild TBI is fatigue. Again, for vets with TBI who are in school, it's better to schedule your classes in the morning if you can, because there's a sundowning effect that happens with TBI. You get, your concentration gets more impaired as the day goes on. Hypervigilance, instead of that you have headache. Flashbacks and nightmares, instead of that you have dizziness. And instead of avoidance, you have noise and light intolerance. So, major depression. I think you're all fairly familiar with major depression. And more complexities.
While I still think of it, while we're talking about transitional issues for veterans and learning situations, one thing occurred to me at the University Summit last week is that military people learn very visually through repetition and with direct supervision. So that is the learning skills that we learn. It's very effective. You can teach a military person anything within a very short amount of time because of that. Academia is very much self-directed study, verbal, writing, research. A lot of military people aren't prepared for that transition. I did put that in the slides, and I think I'm going to update that to include that next time. So let's talk about the transitional issues. The thing I like to emphasize with especially undergraduates is, here's what Generation Kill went through. They were in high school, they saw 9/11. They joined the military after high school. They went to basic, they went to advanced training, they went to war. They came back for a couple months, they went back to war. They came back for a couple months, they went to, they went to war. Then they went from war to transition to back home. And then a few months later, they tried to go to school. So they are literally changing societies. Rules are different, mores, social values, everything is different. So that's the #1 transition issue I talk about when we're talking about veterans. Following into that, we change from warrior mind to family mind. Military society is vastly different from civilian society. Everybody's seen war movies and think they get it, and it's a little peak. Few of them really kind of get it. Strangely enough, one of the best ones was a series called Major Dad. Does anybody remember that series? A lot of those issues that you deal with in the military were actually very accurately. My favorite is the family furniture being lost from duty station to duty station. I have definitely suffered through that. But there's a difference in mindset and society that you go through. The pace is much different, especially in combat. It's a 75,000 RPM world. You deal with constantly. Everything's up-tempo. Get stuff done. Versus, especially in Colorado, a much more laid-back, sedate, regular pace. You don't know that you miss it until you have it, but there's a loss of structure, camaraderie, intensity, proximity. You're in the military, you rely on your buddies, your chain of command, the rules, the structure every day, and you don't realize it. You wake up at 5:30 because that's just the way society tells you to, and if you don't, the first sergeant will toss your ass out of your bunk. It's going to happen one way or the other. You have to be in certain locations. You do certain things in a certain structure. And then when you lose it, you don't realize how much you rely on it. The not fitting in part is huge. One of the things I discussed at the diversity summit we had last week was the hidden population. We try and fit in as best we can, but vets do a lousy job of talking about our experiences in our lives. We just initially wanted to go away and just fit in. And the more we do that, the more we realize we're alienating ourselves. So there's that kind of dichotomy that's happening there. One of the most interesting things I find is difficulty in articulating worth, particularly in hiring. As a former infantry combat leader, I can take my resume and say, I am You know, if I say military, I was an infantry squad leader. And Larry, you immediately get that. Any other Army vets get that. An employer doesn't get that. Now, if I say I was the direct supervisor of a 12-man department. I was responsible for the professional and personal training as well as the physical well-being. I was responsible for individual completion of tasks, and I was directly responsible for over $12 million of equipment. That sounds much different than saying infantry squad leader, but that's what it is, right? Maybe not as much with this conflict, but there still are occurrences of the radioactive or social leper. Everybody has this morbid fascination of, boy, did you kill anybody? They ask the question, and at the same time they're asking that question, they're also revolted by the thought they ask. Like, ooh, you killed somebody. So there's that issue that people are dealing with. One of my favorites is the different penalties for behavior. In the military, you have to show up somewhere at 4 o'clock every day or there's consequences. You get out and you call the cable guy, and you're immediately frustrated with, what do you mean 9 to 12? And they show up at 1, and you say, well, you were supposed to show up between 09 and 1200. Like, no, what's your problem, dude? So there's different penalties for behavior. In a military society, that's very much ingrained for certain things you have to do. In civilian society, it's really not that important. So people have difficulty transitioning into that. Excuse me. There's family problems. There's children are really caught in this conflict because the vast majority of service members now are married. Children are certainly caught in this issue. You can see the numbers, and I know that we've had some people who are interested in working in child development with the Veterans Court grant talk about this, so I'm not even going to touch it. The family structure has changed. You definitely do no longer have this traditional male-dominated family. For example, I know someone that was a female lieutenant colonel. She was in charge of a logistics unit. She was responsible for not only 125 people at every phase of their being, she was responsible for getting the bullets, the mail, the health care, to combat units in the field. As a reservist, she came back and she blew up when her husband asked her, why didn't you pick up the dry cleaning? You know, so you have this incredible jarring role that I am in this incredible executive function with an enormous amount of direct and indirect responsibility. And then I just changed into, you know, now I'm coming back to family, normal, you know, 50 style family, and it's not ever going to go back. And people have a difficult time dealing with that. Jobs evaporating. This is one of my least favorite issues, but it still continues. Reservists and National Guardsmen in this country are being unfairly treated when they go off to war. Employers don't want to hire them because they don't want them gone for a year. I understand that. And even though federal law says they cannot lose their jobs when they deploy, employers are very ingenious in finding ways to do it anyway. The most common one is something called reposition was eliminated. So someone will go off to war, they'll come back like, hey, I'm here to go to work. I'm sorry, we don't have that job for you anymore. Or where's my other job? No, you're just laid off. And it's a way around those federal laws. The relational difficulties are huge. Again, so you have young people coming straight out of high school, they might marry their high school sweethearts after their first tour, they're not ready for marriage, and then you deploy 3, 4, 5 times. You watch the news, you see the unit's been hit, spouses are on Facebook and MySpace and texting, because you can get cell phones pretty easy in Iraq. My best friend, who's deployed a total of 7 times between Gulf War I and Gulf War II, when his vehicle was destroyed by an IED, his wife knew about it through Facebook faster than the casualty assistance officer came to the housing area to tell him about it. Even with that line of communication, it's good and it's bad. Because all of a sudden, if you disappear on a mission for a week and a half, your spouse freaks out. What? What's going on? And then that tension, the endless deployments, the problems, financial and personal, it's made it really tough. I don't know what the divorce rates are in this world. I'll let you talk about that wonderful news. But self-medication. Something I talked about with one of the other vets organizations here in town. You have much different standards of self-medication from the Vietnam era versus the current era. And I will say that my generation and every generation past has been taught to drink alcohol in the military. That don't just say no to drugs has worked effectively. No, we will not touch drugs, but the military teaches you to drink hard, and that's how we self-medicate. The Vietnam era and earlier, they had access to a lot more interesting drugs than we did. They used them. It's a standard thing. If you're having problems, you self-medicate, you don't ask for it. It's institutional to the military. I think we need to update this, but yeah, because of the way military pay structures and problems, 44% qualify for the poverty line in the military family structure. I think that number has come down a slight amount, but it's still incredibly high. All right. Can we talk back about this? All right. Yes, that should be. Did you take yours off?
Thank you. So, some of the interventions that you can utilize in your environment is, if you are sleeping poorly, consult a physician immediately. Because poor sleep will take you down faster than anything else with PTSD and TBI. So minimize, one of the things that I will actually do when I have clients who have TBI is I will go to their house and we will create a working environment for them where we can minimize distractions for them. Put, for example, things like their television and their computer games on timers that they can't get into, and clear the room so that they can actually focus. And we talked about planning most difficult classes for earlier in the days, and take frequent breaks. One of the things that's important to know if you're a professor here is that if your student with TBI gets up, right, after 45 minutes and walks out of the classroom, someone with PTSD and or TBI, what they need to do is get away from it long enough so that they can consolidate for perhaps 10 minutes, 20 minutes. And if you have TBI, you fatigue easily, so it's important to take a lot of breaks during the day. Ask for accommodation, which is your right under the Americans with Disability Act, and I understand that you have a person who specializes in assistive technology here on campus, which is phenomenal, right? If you're a vet with PTSD and or TBI, if you can consult with someone who knows about assistive technology, there's a whole new world out there in terms of aids for learning. There's a pen, for example, a Logitech pen that will record lectures and your notes, and automatically it has a USB port in it. You can plug it into your computer. It will put it into OneNote. OneNote will put it into the appropriate folder. This cool stuff. So use repetition, a lot of repetition, what Dan was talking about, and scaffolding is building on prior knowledge, right, to new knowledge. Fluorescent lighting for people with TBI is very difficult. That's what we mostly have to do. It's because of the oscillation. What it does is cause headaches that can be crippling. So if you can avoid it, do. And the best results come from a combination of cognitive rehabilitation plus cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Plus medication. That's sort of the winning combination that we're getting to right now. So there are pharmacological interventions. For example, a drug that is used a lot with traumatic brain injury is Provigil, which is usually used for people who have narcolepsy or have shift work, but what it does is improve processing speed. And sleep medication. That after traumatic brain injury, the brain processes medication differently. So one of the systems that gets most impacted is the cholinergic system. So if you're taking cold medication, right, which is cholinergic in action, it can really mess you up. So it's important to find out what things you can metabolize if you have TBI and what you can't. For example, caffeine is one of the most difficult things for the TBI brain to metabolize. And what's called guided and distributed practice, which means that with someone who has TBI and or PTSD, actually sitting down with them one-on-one over several distributed practice sessions is the best. It's interactive, it's visual, and it's a good way to help them to learn. And multiple checklists. Checklists are very helpful for people with memory issues. So in summary, since we've had less than 10% of vets come back and our systems are already straining at the seams, right? Straining. We need to prepare for the influx of veterans, and through programs like the one that Laura and Laura administer. Could you tell me the full name of the program?
You haven't gotten that yet?
No.
Jail Diversion Trauma Recovery Priority to Veterans SAMHSA grant. It's Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and there are 13 sites that have received this grant. Colorado was one of the first cohort, one of 6. We're about 2.5 years on it. It's a $2 million over 5-year grant. Veterans Trauma Court, we support that, and that getting going down in Colorado Springs, and are looking for some other places to try and intervene, primarily in our judicial system, post-traumatic stress injuries and traumatic brain injuries, and use of substances, as Marguerite said, they frequently just go hand in glove. And impulsivity, we have many of our guys and women that are getting into some trouble. And so we're trying to intervene with the judicial system to get them trained up on what is a post-traumatic stress injury and a traumatic brain injury, and how does that impact behavior and choices and impulsivity, and how much can they understand, and what are the programs we can get them to get them help, primarily.
Thank you.
Yep.
Do you wonder why I don't remember that? It's a wonderful program. The RAND Corporation study said that effective treatment could pay for itself in as little as 2 years. Do you know what the single largest mental health facility in the United States is? The Los Angeles County Jail. 30 to 40% at any given time of the population of the Los Angeles County Jail is utilizing psychiatric and or psychological services. What's going on in our country is called trans-institutionalization, which means that we take people from things like mental health settings and we put them in prison. And so what we're trying to do is minimize that. And last but not least, we have to honor our vets for their service by treating them adequately, by training our primary care systems, our mental health systems, our judicial systems, our social services systems, so that they can deal with this influx, because 55 to 60% of returning vets will be treated in civilian systems, right? So I thank you so much for your attention, and are we going to take a break?
Yeah.
Questions? We want to do the break at the same time.
Does anybody have a question? Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Earlier on, you talked about the PTSD and chronic pain.
Yes.
So are you saying that the chronic pain is caused by the PTSD, or that it's just a co-occurring thing because I'm injured?
It can be both, or either. Actually, the mechanism by which PTSD spreads in the brain is called kindling, which if you've ever been in a forest fire and you see a tree go on fire and then the tree next to it goes on fire, it's not usually because cinders have fallen on it. It's because the gases superheat right around this tree and the tree next to it explodes. And that's the mechanism of PTSD in the brain. It lights up these random pathways. It is the exact same mechanism in chronic pain. Chronic pain is a kindling mechanism. And what you find with chronic pain is that most people don't get treatment soon enough. If you have chronic pain and you don't go for treatment within the first 90 days, there are permanent changes that take place in the dorsal horn of the brain that are very, very difficult to interrupt. So some of the best treatments now that they have for chronic pain are actually anticonvulsant medications. What they've found is that giving people opiates and narcotics actually causes rebound chronic pain that can frequently be worse than the original pain. So it's a whole different practicum. So yes, PTSD can cause chronic pain, and injury can cause chronic pain. And both, you're screwed. Ma'am.
Well, I was thinking about, as we're talking about PTSD and traumatic brain injury, that what if you already had depression? What if you already had, I was thinking of thyroid disorder because you have cognitive impairment, sometimes like that. So you had ADHD, ADD, thyroid issues, or you had depression, and then you have that on top of that, or, does it just compound it? Is it just like you're saying, injury on injury? Is it like that?
Yes, except yes, and in the case of ADD or actually they want to separate ADD from ADHD, right? But it's in those cases it's more like ADHD times PTSD, right? It's because they're both right brain dominant. Thyroid issues, what you frequently see in people who have PTSD is adrenal dysfunction, which they're just beginning to address in the functional medical literature. And so what I would suggest is that for people who have thyroid issues, frequently what preceded that was an adrenal issue. So I would suggest that you consult someone who specializes in functional medicine and get your adrenals back on track so that you can hold that, you can take that piece out. Unfortunately, this is not yet a service that's available at the VA.
I was just thinking it would be so hard to how much time it would take to say, oh, you have this issue and pull that out and treat that, and then to really get to what the real issue is to be able to treat it. And that could be,
Frequently, if someone comes in and tells me that they have thyroid issues, or they look like they might have thyroid issues, because I can't go into it because we don't have time, but there's a specific physical confirmation to it, I will send them. There's a woman here in town named Carol Lipper, who is a functional medicine physician. I will send them to her. She does a bunch of tests, and in 3 months, these people feel significantly better. So I call it draining the swamp, so you can see where the alligators are. And what symptom? Obviously, I'm participating with their psychiatrist in treating them for insomnia, but what's left after 3 months is what we treat. Anyone else? Yes?
I was curious when you mentioned that a lot of vets lie on their debriefing assessments when they return home, and I'm interested to know, are they looking at all like at working with that, like once they are back within the family system and using the family system in the treatment process, or is it still set up where vets would be sent away for a month and kept from going home?
Actually, there just was on Capitol Hill yesterday, as a matter of fact, Senate Armed Services Committee beat up both the director of the DoD for Transition Services and the deputy director of the VA about the same sort of issue, that now that guys are actually coming out and saying I need this help, there's a disconnect about how long they're staying on active duty rather than getting out, so they're missing jobs and they're missing the VA. So on one end, it's getting better, people are reporting it, but what's happening is the Veteran Benefit Administration. Back up. VA is a giant organization, and it's essentially made up of two big parts. There's others, but for clarity's sake. There's a Veteran Health Administration, which is the one that gives care. And there's the Veteran Benefit Administration that decides what you get from the VA, simplistically. It's a lot more complex than that. What the VA was using under the previous administration was, you get your screening, you'd get out, you'd have problems. You'd go to complain to the VA would pull it up and say, you said nothing, get lost. Right? There is some backtracking on that now. They're trying to consolidate well, you lied to get the hell out screening you did to, Vet Center still screens preliminary for TBI right now, right? Very general screening.
Nice.
Right? But not sophisticated. If something pings up when you see somebody, you're going to direct it back to the VA. There's still a mess going on at the VA level of, okay, you're saying you've got symptoms now, but you didn't say you had symptoms then. They're still working that out. I would say they're trying. It's still far from where it is.
Yeah, I can jump in too. Now they're doing the PHRA when you exit theater, and then 90 days to 120 days later too. So they're giving them the opportunity to do it twice, because they recognize people aren't going to say anything right out of theater because they want to go home. So now they're coming back 120 days later, and they're saying a lot more, and they get a lot more referrals. So they're addressing it piece by piece.
Well, they're also lying about having a traumatic brain injury so that they can stay in theater.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, because a lot of these guys don't want to leave, they don't want to leave their unit, and so they're lying about concussive incidences and stuff to be able to stay in theater with their buddies because they're scared to death to come out.
Well, and sometimes they're not lying about the PTSD, because what we know in veterans is that a lot of times it happens later. And that's the problem with the diagnostic criteria, is that it says that they had to experience intense fear, helplessness, and horror in the moment. But if you're trained to do that, you may not experience that till later. So that's also a barrier for veterans.
Absolutely. Heroic defenses fall at different times.
Exactly.
well, and I think there's also an issue that I understand, which is that when you're in still active duty, a fear of reporting your symptoms because then you'll be dishonorably discharged. And that was coming up, at least in the news, quite a bit a year and a half ago.
I'm specifically involved in that 2006 to 2007. What was happening at Fort Carson is when guys would present these symptoms, they come back, self-medicate with alcohol, miss formations, forget that they were on the duty roster because they had TBI and PTSD. They were separating them under the chapter process, which is an administrative process that unfortunately deprived you of your veteran benefits. At the time, they were separating them under something called personality disorder, which was not a dishonorable discharge. It was a general discharge, but it cut them off from the benefits. Congressional action happened, they cut that off. Now the Army's found a loophole called adjustment disorder discharges. So they're doing the same thing all over again. They're doing it a little better. Yes, there have been some issues with that. Worst was 2006 and 2007. The Army's making huge strides. People are admitting that it's happening to them. Part of it is what I call the Black Knight syndrome in the military. And for everybody that's seen Monty Python, I know that's a big bruise, but that's literally what it is. You get your arm cut off, it's like, it's just a flesh wound. I'm not as bad as my buddy, you should go help my buddy. He's in better shape. There's a system of denial that's built into everything. So for a long time, people were using that denial to keep it away. 3-star general that was a deputy assistant division commander in special operations has come out and said, I am suffering from PTSD. If I can come forward and do this, you can too. And there has been a change within at least the Army. I don't know how the Marine Corps is still struggling with it. They still have the Warrior Society going. But there's an institutional model that says don't admit you're wounded. And weirdly enough, you will cry if you break your leg and go to the aid station. But if you're suffering nightmares and can't sleep and having flashbacks for some reason, you don't tell anybody that. It's a societal thing as much as they are.
Well, it's also fear that you're going crazy.
Marine in the back.
Yes, there's several initiatives that's going on in the military right now. The Army had battle mind, now they have resiliency training, and they're incorporating families as well as veterans. The Marine Corps, they have this combat operational stress control. That's another part of them trying to incorporate the families and taking care of. They have pre-deployment briefs, pre-division briefs, and redeployment briefs as well too. And again, after the PDHRAs, what happens with the Navy and Marine Corps is they go back another 120 days, and they have another class on post-deployment issues and everything else like that. Because I did that for the Marine Corps when I got out.
Matter of fact, the person, the Army general in charge of the resiliency training that just recently got appointed, she was the Army major that was shot down and captured the last day of Gulf War I. She's now promoted to 2-star general. She's now in charge of that training. I think that's a pretty damn good person to be in charge of that training in the Army.
And Carter Hamp, who was the 4-star general who was in charge of all NATO forces in Europe, came out and said that he had PTSD, which was immense for a 4-star general.
We used to have a really good advocate for Carson. General Graham had lost 2 sons, one to suicide, one to combat. When he took over at Fort Carson, he made post-traumatic stress injury treatment a forefront issue of his command. Worked really effectively with this. His wife is still very hugely actively involved. He's in Forces Command right now, and unfortunately, since it's a staff weenie assignment, he doesn't have as much go in the corporation. Once he gets promoted out and assumes a bigger command, I am fully confident whatever command he's in charge of, he will make PTSI a #1 issue of his command. So things are changing, it's just changing slowly.
Any other questions?
I was just going to go back to what she was saying. The other thing is they don't want to talk about it or tell about it because if they're in a position where they have a clearance and the work that they've done has been, high-level security, they're afraid if they talk about it or if they say they have an issue or if they have to go to mental health, that's going to affect that clearance. That means they want their jobs.
Right, but they've changed those rules so it doesn't affect it, but the prevailing...
The water cooler talk is still
right,
an issue.
Right, it's still the issue. So part of that also problem is even Fort Carson, a duty station is deployed. I think only the guys up in Alaska have deployed more times than Fort Carson. There's still significant command individuals that have never deployed. They've spent their career in Fort Carson. So when they're faced with this issue, they fall back to the old military standards of pull your head out of your ass. You're just being weak. They don't understand the issue. They fall back on the institutional knowledge of saying, well, this is what was done when I was in private, and the issue gets worse. That needs to change as well. The military is trying to address that, but that's almost a function of being deployed or not.
So you're saying that for personality disorders, they can't cut people's benefits off, but for adjustment disorders, they can?
No, they do it for both.
Okay.
What they do in both cases, what they'll say is, you lied on your enlistment paperwork. You had this issue and didn't disclose it, therefore your enlistment is fraudulent. We won't charge you with any charges, we're just going to kick you out of the military with no benefits. That means no access to VA health care, no access to any sort of separation pay, or anything else like that. You're just on the street.
Is there a diagnosis they can get where that doesn't happen?
I can't answer that question. I know what happens is the military teaches you to put up with being miserable. That's a honed skill that they teach you. You can put up with any miserable situation, and it seems common. You put up with this, you're deployed, you've seen your buddies die, you're sick of living in the desert in the dust, and all of a sudden here's an opportunity to get out. Get out scot-free. We're not going to hold anything. You don't owe us any money. Just get out. Guys jump out. They don't think through what's happening and demand their rights.
Which is also part of their diagnosis.
Right. And what happens? What's one of the things we said before judgment? numbness, it adds up. So guys say, fine, I'll take it, I'll get out. They start to have problems, say, I need help from the VA. VA, by federal law, says, no, we can't help you. So that's where the community has to pick it up. Whether we like it or not, the community is going to have to provide mental health care for these guys because they're coming back.
And there is a program called Give an Hour where licensed clinicians, hopefully those with trauma experience, can sign up to give an hour a week or more free to veterans and or their families for therapeutic purposes. So it's a good program. If you're a licensed clinician, just go to the website, which is Give an Hour.
Give an hour over.
And hopefully sign up.
Marguerite's far too humble. She's taking care of one of my veterans with a lot of help. And he's made huge progress under your care. So,
Those to God's ears.
right. So I saw somebody else's hand pop up over.
I was going to tell about Give an Hour.
Okay, all right, never mind.
So we're going to take a break for about
Yeah.
10 minutes,
Yeah.
and then we're going to listen to Katie Barr from the Vet Center. So go eat.
Thank you, guys.